It's awesome to be here at Rebelmouse offices down in Soho with VP of Product Megan Berry. She previously led community at Klout, Stanford graduate, New York City foodie. Awesome guest for us to have on our first episode of Employees Only.
Thank you for having me.
So I think a cool place to start would just to learn a little bit more about Rebelmouse, what you guys do, how it started, kind of where you're at now.
Yeah, so Rebelmouse started about 4 years ago. We are a platform for social, viral, and distributed content. Basically what that means is we're essentially the platform to post content if it was built today, as opposed to a lot of the things out there like WordPress and some others that were started many years ago in a world before social and before how we communicate now. And so we don't let you just create content, we help you get it out there. And so a lot of what we do starts after publish, and we work with big brands and media companies primarily.
Very cool, very cool. And what's your role, what capacity to join the company at versus what's your role now?
Well, Rebelmouse has evolved a lot in the 4 years. So when we started, we were actually we had free product that anyone could use, and that was more of our focus. And now we kind of evolved more into the enterprise. So when we started, I was leading social product and community. So a lot has changed since then, and now I'm our VP of product and primarily focused around kind of building this enterprise SaaS platform.
So I've also had product roles in the past, and it's always been a challenge explaining it to friends and family who aren't in tech.
What would you say you do here?
When you explain it to people who maybe are in tech, how do you really dumb down and simplify the product role that you play?
Yeah, I think really what I actually think about it this way sometimes for myself is the engineers are the stars of what we're doing, and I try to help them get as much done as possible.
Okay, awesome.
So that's kind of my goal, is to organize everything so that when they come in and they're going to work on something, they're clear on how it should look, what the goals are, what we're hoping to get done, what our deadlines are. They're happy with how the UX looks, and it's as easy to create as possible. And that's true, then I've done my job.
Cool. And so this is a really hard question, so I apologize, but I think startups are all about product, and that's really kind of how you create value for your company and create value for customers. So who and how is it decided what gets built and when, if there is anything in pushing assistance?
That is the question.
Yeah, that's the question.
I think a good product person knows that they're the organizer of everything that the company's trying to do. So if you're saying I thought of everything and I decided everything, and then it can't possibly be true, so you're lying. And so really what I'm doing is I'm trying to take in organizing all the ideas. We get tons of ideas from clients, from potential clients, from our own team internally, in the conversations with engineering, obviously our CEO and his vision of the product. So it's about bringing all of that together into some semblance of an organized product vision and what phase one of that looks like. So I guess I didn't totally answer your question.
No, but that's really helpful, and I think you're right. That's kind of the magic of each unique startup of how that gets done, and hopefully you get it right over time.
Right.
Very cool. And so Rebelmouse is a super distributed company as well, right? So you're managing engineers here, elsewhere, all over the world.
We have 100 people total. Only 30 of them are here in New York. And we have people in India, in Serbia, in Slovenia, in Argentina, really, really all over, and all distributed, not necessarily in other offices. And I guess there's a lot I could say about it. It's been amazing. It's so fun to work with them. When something happens across the world, I feel like I have this different reference point now. Because instead of being something happened in Chile, I'm oh my God, how's Francisco?
Right.
Francisco, are you okay? Is your family okay? And I feel like it actually makes me a better person to have that global sense.
Right. Yeah, so actually one thing that would be fun to talk about is a little bit of the journey from the original vision of a very social kind of consumer product into now an enterprise product that's doing really well. So
I think we've been lucky in that the vision has evolved rather than pivoted, which I think, some startups really pivoted and they're okay, we're going in a totally different direction. We were okay, websites aren't paying attention to social. And that was kind of our underlying thesis when we started. And then we looked at, okay, so we're going to aggregate all this social content into your website. We have had all these tools, which we still have around bringing in social content and then freezing certain things.
And social content meaning like Twitter, Facebook,
yes,
Pinterest, whatever.
yes,
whatever.
Exactly. All the like little tweets, Facebook posts, a photo, whatever you post everywhere, we were like kind of bringing together into your website. And it was really cool. We got a great reaction to that. But we realized we needed something more to actually help people go viral and get their message spread. And that's when we started moving to something more like what we have today, which is more of a full-fledged platform. And we discovered that brands and media companies sort of have more of like a willingness to dive in deep with us in a way that we didn't see from like our original small business market. So that's kind of why we shifted, is like, to say it in a very simple way, it was hard to get $9.99 a month for like a product oriented towards small business. But when we said, okay, let's instead create a power product and we can sell it for, $5K a month. Obviously it varies on a bunch of things. That we started seeing more success with. Gotcha. So that's where we shifted.
Makes it obvious that way. So what are some like cool, like particularly cool ways that, and if you can't name clients, that's totally fine, but like kind of cool ways that your clients are able to use Rebelmouse to amplify their content, to get more out of social, whatever it might be.
Yeah, totally. I guess I'll give you an example. I work with this client a lot. The Dodo was our first kind of like full use of our platform, and they're a media company oriented around animals. And they've been around now for about 2 years, and up until about 2 months ago, they didn't have a single engineer or designer. Oh, wow. So they just hired their edit team, and then we are the tech platform behind the Dodo. Gotcha. And now we have sort of a program where they can develop themselves, and they've hired one engineer. But the point being, like, usually a media company has all these expenses around hiring engineers and building the platform it all sits on. But we were able to do that for them and have this sort of partnership of, discovering so many cool things around growth, like these call to action units on the article page, and like, when you scroll down in mobile, like how do the share buttons float as you go, and like all these like little things that have added up to something big. Very cool.
And are you guys able to leverage those insights like across clients, or do you find it's much more like specific to a property or specific to a brand?
I'd say most things can be leveraged across clients in the things you learn. Like the specific stuff is probably more like, the Dodo has a petition around animals that's very specific for them, but like the floating share buttons, that's true for almost anyone.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Right?
Yeah.
And maybe there are little differences in terms of like, the color of the buttons
and
those sorts of things. But in general, if something works, all our clients want it.
Very cool. Very cool. So maybe we can relay a little bit into your experience at Klout right before Rebelmouse. So how did you get started at Klout? You were pretty young, I think, when you joined up. And what was that experience like? And we can dive in a little bit after.
Yeah. So I was at MobClicks, which was a mobile ad exchange, and I'd been there for about a year when I went to South by Southwest for the first time. Okay. And I went to the Twitter party.
So what is the Twitter party at South by Southwest like? Because I haven't even been, so I'm super curious.
Well, it's like a lot of nerds partying.
Nice.
It's an interesting mix
like
where you realize like people who used to be totally made fun of are feeling like in control.
Yeah.
So I was at the party. I had like played with Klout. It's very, very new. And I met the founder, and I kind of told him like all the things I thought they should be doing that they weren't. Like honestly, I'd had like a couple beers. Sure. I was just like being super honest at the party. Yeah. And then he was like, I really want to hire you. Nice.
Quick disclaimer, like the going up to founders with ideas works really well if you have really good ideas, if they're really cool, and if both of you have had a bunch of beers to start probably. Otherwise it can go sideways. Just want to cover our bases here.
Note, yeah. Okay. But yeah, I love the team, and I, there was some debate about what I should do. There's always like this mental debate when you're like, oh, should I actually leave? Should I take that leap? It was the first time I'd ever done that. Right. Like, quit a job and move on to something else. And I think it's harder in startups than in anything else, because it's like there's this idea like, oh, it's not business, it's not personal, it's business. Yep. But it's actually the opposite.
Absolutely. Like they're your best friends for whatever period of time. They're like, you can't even avoid it. It's
exactly. You spend all this time with people, you go out to happy hours, you're like working hard together, and then suddenly you're like, oh, it's not you, it's me.
Right. Yeah, okay, cool. So let's talk a little bit about community at Klout, because Klout's a really interesting company, I think, especially from a community perspective. I remember I used to use it a ton because I just believed it was the best way to gauge influence for whatever the different use case would be. So what was it like to run community at Klout? What did that kind of mean? How do you think it's impacted the way you work now?
Yeah. Again, it shifted. I was there for about 2 years. So in the beginning, we were like really like just like, how do we get people to talk about us? How do we get people to trust this score? And we kind of really focused on targeting people with higher scores and saying like, okay, by our own measure, we think these are the influencers.
Right.
So like we should eat our own dog food and like try to target these people and talk to them and get them to kind of be our evangelists. And it was a lot about like creating content, like creating blog posts that would be helpful to them. Actually, what I partially told Joe Fernandez, the founder, when I went up to him is like, you have all this data, like why aren't you like creating all these great posts around that data and like helping people like use your score and helping them like do their jobs better because of the data you had. So that was kind of like what we tried to do and like a big part of the mission early on. Then later we got really big, so it was a lot more about like how do you handle lots of people and how do you handle support. And actually at some point early on I had my cell phone number on my email signature. And we would do support messages just through email because that was like the stage we were at. And someone's Klout score dropped and they called my cell phone crying, like literally crying. And I was trying to like empathize, but it was this weird thing like, oh my God, I think we've like done it.
Yeah, you've hit something and people are crying about it.
We made someone cry and I don't feel good about it, but then like I guess people care about this thing we're doing. And you know, it was interesting too, like people would come up and be like, because it's a score, right? So people like want to be higher on the scale and they're insulted if they're lower. But people would come and say like, I don't think I should be entirely defined by one number. And I was like, I agree. Like, please define yourself by more than this one score. Like, you are more than that.
That's wild. I remember there was a little bit of resentment whenever my Klout score would go down.
Yeah.
Like, what, am I less interesting? Like, what has happened?
What did I do?
What do I need to do to improve this?
Right. And that's like, we tried then, like, one of the things we did to combat that is to focus on like your topics of influence.
Oh,
like,
right, I remember that.
To try to get people to think about, you had kind of this like, it was like this personality type where like you were a curator, you were a thought leader, you were whatever, and then it was like topics that you were influential about. So we were trying to get people like, the score was like on its face the most interesting thing. We were trying to get people to look beyond that because the score was also the most controversial thing.
Fair enough. That's smart.
I didn't know that like social media management could really be a whole career.
Okay.
Like, because it was
that
point in the industry, and it was that point in my life too, where it was like
were just maturing.
They were just the first community managers, and it was like, is this real? And it was kind of, there was a sense in the industry at that time of like, we didn't know if it affected your bottom line.
Got it. Yep.
And we did like a little sort of stats thing at MobClicks where we looked at how what I was doing in social and newsletters and blog content was affecting our revenue, and we actually proved it. And I was like, oh my God, it works.
Awesome. Yeah.
Because it's rare actually to be able to do that.
Sure, I was going to say, that's pretty good attribution,
So that was like, for me, like amazing. Like, oh, this is actually a real thing, a career that like affects companies.
Right, very cool, awesome. So yeah, you've been kind of like definitely an early foundational employee at a couple awesome companies. And so have you thought about what you want to do next? Is it starting your own company? Is it really owning this serial builder joiner mentality? What does it look like?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think about starting my own company for sure. Like, I don't think you can work in startups without thinking about it. Right. But what I've learned from working so closely with founders is that it's really hard to be a founder, and you have to be really passionate about your idea to succeed. I think you have to be so passionate that you can't not do your idea. You dream about it, you like think about it when you're supposed to be paying attention to other people, and like that's your moment when you're ready to dive in. And I think that I probably will have that moment at some point in my life, but I'm gonna wait for it to be real and not like jump into something just because I kind of want to found something.
Yeah, no, I think that's like a mistake a lot of people make.
Yeah.
I think I may have made that mistake, where it's like you conflate like really wanting to experience that founder narrative and really live it for yourself, because you're kind of like you're effectively running the same exercises over and over and over again, but then being sure that this is a problem you're willing to not sleep for an extended period of time, right?
Right.
Like I'll get obsessed with ideas that'll last 3 months, 6 months even, but then 6 years is a totally different ballgame.
Exactly, and it'll change, and you have to deal with issues and like ultimately what I think, I don't know, from a third party view looking at the founder role, I feel like the hardest thing is you have to make the final call.
Sure.
And it's nice sometimes, even though it's like I have to make a lot of calls, but sometimes it's nice to be like, oh my God, I don't know what to do. Like,
right.
it's like, it's somewhat like the founder has to decide. Like,
yeah.
they can't not decide.
Yeah.
That's their job. And that's a lot of stress.
Yeah. And I've seen it, like, especially early on, you got the idea as like the founder, often the CEO, they get to carve out what they want to work on and what their job is. And a lot of times it's like they have to do all the stuff that other people can't or aren't
Right.
interested in doing, right? Because it's not their specialty, it's not what they were hired for. All right, so then we have like a couple questions that I'm going to try to be asking people routinely throughout it. So what's been the most surprising thing about working at startups?
I think probably that thing we talked about before about how personal it is. I think there's this idea that like, oh, business is like, it's this thing you like, it's like a 9 to 5, or like, but that's not how startups are at all. And it reaches into every aspect of your life. And like, you know, it's like, of course I had a fight with my boyfriend many times about how often I check my email.
True.
And I've not slept because I woke up at 3 a.m. and I'm like, oh my God, I didn't tell like the person in India about this thing, and now their whole day is gonna go by and I didn't, and I wake up and I like send them the email,
right.
and it's like, it affects like everything about your life. And so I think there's this idea going into it like, oh, I'm gonna have such great work-life balance, but like that's pretty impossible.
Right. So then I guess what might be one piece of advice or several pieces of advice it can be that you would give to folks thinking about getting into startups or starting to work at one?
Yeah, I guess it would vary kind of on your familiarity with startups already. I think if you're diving into this world for the first time, I would talk to a bunch of people. And talk to people who you think you want to be at startups and ask them how they got started and what they really do, because it's often not what you think they do. And really like take a lot of time to understand, and then you're also building a network that you'll be able to use later. But first, don't use it, just like build it and talk to people and start to be someone who understands what is happening in the space and at least like some semblance of who's important.
Sure.
And then you can like figure out your next steps. I think if you're someone who's further along and maybe you've already done that, it's about choosing a startup that you are really passionate about, because it is those long hours and those long, like you have to kind of be mentally there with it. And that's so much easier if you're excited about the mission, because if it's not fun, you can't work that long.
Absolutely. I love the piece of advice of trying to identify the person you want to be.
Yeah.
And reach out to them. And I imagine you might be getting some emails now. Like probably LinkedIn.
Sure, yeah.
Random. LinkedIn is the place where most of this like cold outreach happens a lot of times, which means it goes unchecked for a long time.
Right.
But cool. Okay. And then I guess the last piece, which I think you have a unique perspective on, is you kind of like, you know, went to school on the West Coast, grew up on the West Coast, worked at companies on the West Coast.
Yeah.
Now you've been on the East Coast for the last several years. Do you see any like kind of like clear differences or even like nuanced differences between the East Coast and West Coast startups?
Yeah. Definitely. I guess there's a few key things. One thing I found in sort of, specifically for me, San Francisco versus New York, because those are the two things I know. And in San Francisco, I felt like the culture was in general more engineering focused. Like the businesses that are built are more around like, oh my God, what a cool engineering challenge we have, and like talking about that. Whereas New York tends, I mean, obviously these are just generalizations, but it tends to be more about a specific industry, a specific goal, and there tends to be more of a plan around revenue earlier.
Right.
I've seen in New York companies. And I think it is because there's so many industries here, there's so much of this sense, like you have Wall Street, you fashion, you have everything.
Yeah, you got Wall Street,
companies.
Madison Avenue, Fifth Avenue, all these like
exactly.
prototypical.
And so they're more focused around, we're going to do this thing, and here's our plan for how we're going to make money. And I feel like San Francisco, there's this bubble where everyone works in tech.
Yeah.
So we're like, we're just going to kind of like solve this thing that we have no idea how to make money about.
Sure.
Like, so it's kind of a different mentality. And I think both, you can succeed in both places, but you get different conversations when you're talking to other startups. Like, I feel like New York is way more like to the point.
Okay. Yeah.
I went to a couple events and it was very like, hi, I do this and I'm looking for this out of this event. Like people schedule, there's like, this is my time to like find a co-founder.
Right.
And they
That's a ton of meetup traffic is like, I'm here to find a technical co-founder. I'm also here to find a technical co-founder. Okay, see you later.
Yeah. And it was just so strange to me. Like, I remember like I walked into this meetup and someone, and this happened many times, where someone would be like, so what's your purpose in attending this event? And I'm like, to check it out.
Wow.
Like and that had never been asked to me in San Francisco, and I went to a ton of events.
Okay, so there's been a lot of kind of advocacy, or it's turning into advocacy now, but it started with conversation about women in tech and what it's like to be a woman in tech. And so I'd love to hear kind of what your experience has been, having been in it for most of your career.
Yeah. I mean, I guess in general, I think there's not enough women in tech, and like that's a problem. I think there are a lot of reasons that is. Starting from, what happens in maybe even primary school, what happens in college, et cetera. There's a lot of things in the chain. For me, I've had mostly positive experiences, but not 100% either. Like, I won't get into them because, I don't know, I think it's a challenge for women in tech because you want to be an advocate, but you also don't want to just focus on that aspect, because I think there's a lot of awesome things about being a woman in tech, and I want to encourage like every woman like watching to like do that. And I think it's great, and I think that there's no reason you should be held back in any way because of it. But I think for the men in tech, I think you should also think about the fact that like, okay, if we don't have many women, like let's be conscious of that. Let's try to work towards being more inclusive. There's a lot of the things I've encountered most are really subtle things where nothing was done intentionally. Like intentional sexism isn't a thing I've experienced.
Right.
I know others have. And it's like, oh, can you go get coffee? I'm like, why should I go get coffee? And it's like, maybe you would have asked anyone.
So that's not intentional.
No, because they're not, it's like, it's a casual thing. They're not thinking they're doing it because you're the woman in the room. And maybe they even aren't. Like, to be fair, like, they're probably gonna ask someone to get coffee.
Right.
And maybe it could have just as easily been a guy, but maybe not.
Yeah.
You just, like, be careful, like, oh, let me not ask the only woman in the room to get coffee, even if, like, it isn't because of that.
Sure.
And so, like, those little subtle signals, I think, can make a big difference.
Do you feel like you're seeing things improve within your network and access points, but also maybe more generally?
Yeah, I think that we've definitely opened up the conversation. I think that conversation is helpful. And so, yeah, I think things are getting better.
Okay, cool. So this has been a blast. Thanks for joining us. And thanks for hosting us at Rebelmouse. You've been great.
Thanks for having me.
One more time. Sorry, guys. Because
I feel like you're just messing with them.
Okay.
He's like, come on, be more interesting.
Right. Like, what else do I say?
Wait, should you say, like, this has been employees only? Like, do you want to build your...
Should I say that?